Hello, BookTube. Well, we're continuing on with our read-along of Anthony Trollope's novel, The Prime Minister. And the chapters that we're reading today are intensely political. They're intensely political for a number of different reasons. The overarching reason, of course, is that our old friend, the Duke of Omnium, has become Prime Minister of England. He's leading a coalition government that includes, the Rattlers and the Barrington Earls and Wilson Shugart and all of these old regular stagers. At one point, Lady Glencora says they're the same old dirty cards. You just reshuffle them in every administration. And the Duke has to point out to her with a little bit of wounded pride that he himself is one of those dirty cards. But that is the overarching political theme of the whole novel, is his travails as the head of a coalition government. It's obvious right from the beginning that he's not cut out for it. It's an agony to him. The job that he has to do is an agony to him. In the chapters that we're reading today, he mentions, or Trollope's narrator mentions, that he could not be communicative and he could not be jovial, and that therefore he probably has no business ruling Englishmen. And in conversations that the Duke of Omnium has with his friend, the Duke of St. Bungay, he comes right out and says, I feel like I'm a failure. I feel like I shouldn't have accepted this job. It's not something for me. And the old Duke he's trying to be jovial about it. He's trying to just be supportive, but you can tell that he's horrified. What on earth? Where is this coming from? He tells the Duke of Omnium at one point that the Duke of Omnium's main weakness is a kind of sensitive nervousness, a kind of nervous sensibility, and that he should rid himself of it as of a disease. But we know by this point that there's no way that he can do it. He's just the way he is, remarkably shy and thin-skinned for someone who has been in politics his whole life, which is a very different story from his wife. Lady Glencora is in her glory in this part of the book. When she learns that her husband is going to be Prime Minister, she makes a decision of her own immediately to spend money like it was going out of style. Her own money and his. Throw open his palatial country estates, including Gatherum Castle, this enormous pile, and fill them with guests. Make his hospitality a glorious thing, the talk of the country, as a way of boosting the fortunes of the coalition government. She says, we have it at one point, she puts it really well. Let me see if I can find it. I dog-eared pages, even though I know that some of you are going to hate me for that. She says at one point here, hospitality should run from a man with his wealth and his position like water from a fountain. As his hand is known to be full, so it should be known to be open. When the delight of his friends is in question, he should know nothing of cost. Pearls should drop from him as from a fairy. And that it's a great plan, and she maintains, she maintains at one point that it is working. The Duke tells her at one point in the chapters that we're reading today that it has been a failure and it has to stop. This constant stream of people in and out of all of his houses, this constant expenditure of money on archery grounds and potted plants and whatnot, all has to stop. That he wants to live without that for the rest of his time in office. And she is astounded by that. We have tried it, and it has failed, and let there be an end of it, he had said to her. Simple and direct disobedience to such an order was as little in her way as simple or direct obedience. She knew her husband well, and knew how he could be managed and how he could not be managed. When he declared that there should be an end of it, meaning an end to the very system by which he hoped to perpetuate his power, she did not dare to argue with him, and yet he was so wrong. The trial had been no failure. The thing had been done well and had succeeded. Was failure to be presumed because one impertinent puppy had found his way into the house, and then to abandon the system at once, whether it had failed or whether it had succeeded, would be to call attention to all the world to the acknowledged failure, to a failure so disreputable that its acknowledgement must lead to the loss of everything. It was known now, so argued the Duchess to herself, that she had devoted herself to the work of cementing and consolidating the coalition by graceful hospitality, which the wealth of herself and her husband enabled her to dispense. She had made herself a prime ministress by the manner in which she opened her saloons, her banqueting halls, and her gardens. It had never been done before, and now it had been done well. There had been no failure, and yet everything was to be broken down because his nerves had received a shock. She's astounded at his decision. And the impertinent puppy in question here is a captain called Major Putney, who is one of the hanger-on guests, one of the demi-monde that Trollope describes so well. Always manages to find himself at great country estates, always manages to be invited. At one point, an old lady who the Duke of Omnium has taken to walking and talking with every day, the Lady Rosina, who's a crabby and idiosyncratic old lady who never tells a lie, of course, sort of gently pokes fun at him. You don't know this man? How is he in your house if you don't know him? He's just one of the hangers-on that Lady Glen thinks are the kind of people you invite to fill a household. A gallant on the archery field, someone who makes good conversation at dinner or at parties or whatnot. And the horrible impertinence happens when the Duke is out walking one cold day. And the seat for the borough of Silverbridge is going to come open. The man who held it is going to retire from it. And that means it's wide open. And in times past, like for instance in the time of the old Duke of Omnium, the Duke of Omnium, the castle as it were, the Gatherum Castle, would simply nominate a candidate, and often that candidate would simply walk over the election. There would be no contest. It was just an assumed thing in the borough that the borough belonged to the Duke, and that he could have a man in Parliament of his own choosing. Reforms have been sweeping the country for 50 years, and they are intense at the time in which Trollope is writing, to get rid of so-called rotten boroughs, to just eliminate that whole system. Why should a duke who's been at his country estate for 800 years be able to put politicians in office that are supposed to make the laws of the country? That is obviously corrupt and has to stop. So, when the Silverbridge seat comes open, the Duke wants nothing to do with it. He is thinking that he will just distance himself, that he is a reformer at heart himself and doesn't want there to be rotten boroughs. His wife thinks that's insane. Lady Glen thinks that's insane. Why on earth would you give up the ability to extend your power in that way? Who would even thank you for it? What do you gain by it? You only lose. And she has a favorite in mind for the seat of Silverbridge, and it is Ferdinand Lopez, the very same speculator that we saw in the previous chapters that we read, of wanting to woo Emily Wharton to marry her over her father's objections, because Ferdinand Lopez, according to old Mr. Wharton, is not a gentleman. His last name, for instance, is Portuguese. He appears to have no family. He does not seem to be our kind of people. Mr. Wharton doesn't want his daughter to marry Ferdinand Lopez. And it turns out Ferdinand Lopez is also an ingratiating sort of fellow. He's well-spoken, he's attractive, he's charming, and he has managed to charm Lady Glen. She has him in mind for the Silverbridge seat. But there are other people who kind of want that seat and who think they know what they're about. And one of them is Major Putney, who goes. Major Putney addresses the Duke while he's out walking, and it's horrific. Putney has memorized the speech to say to the Duke. It's just awful. We all know that Silverbridge will soon be vacant. Let me assure your Grace that if it might be consistent with your Grace's plans in other respects to turn your kind countenance towards me, you will find that you have no supporter than whom none would be more staunch, and perhaps I may say one who in the House would not be the least useful. Just horrible, oily stuff. And he goes on. Trollope says he goes on to his own destruction. He says, yes, he tells us nothing asked, nothing have had been adopted as the motto of the Major's life, and more than once he had expressed to his friend that, by George, if you've only cheek enough, there is nothing you cannot get. On this emergency, the Major certainly was not deficient in cheek. He says, if I might be allowed to consider myself your Grace's candidate, I should indeed be a happy man. The Duke has long since stopped smiling at him, but the Major doesn't notice. And the Duke's answer is awe-inspiring. He says, I think, sir, said the Duke, that your proposition is the most unbecoming and the most impertinent that was ever addressed to me. And he walks off with the Major's mouth literally hanging open. He walks off and storms in to his wife and says, enough of this. Who is this person? I don't want him invited to any of my homes anymore. But in addition to that, I don't want this hospitality business to go on anymore. This is totally soiling to me, to have people coming up and asking me in my own home for this kind of backstage favor. And it shocks his wife, but he can't let it alone. He sends a brief note to the Major. The Duke of Omnium trusts that Major Putney will not find it inconvenient to leave Gatherum Castle shortly. Should Major Putney wish to remain at the castle over the night, the Duke of Omnium hopes that he will not object to being served his dinner and his breakfast in his own room. A carriage and horses will be ready for Major Putney's use to take him to Silverbridge as soon as Major Putney may express to the servants his wish to that effect. Oh, oh my! so as we can see, the Duke's political life is miserable. He is not happy. As I mentioned last time, he's the only man in England who wouldn't be happy being Prime Minister, and he's miserable. And getting more miserable, because it seems like he's going to have to lay down in the muck in order to do this job, what he perceives as laying down in the muck. The Duke of St. Bungay would have handled it perfectly. He knows exactly what to do. The Duke will not be ruled by his old friend. Instead, he pricks against the traces, and to no one's good, to misery all around, has very harsh words with his wife. Because although she's been told that she may not interfere in Silverbridge, she may not put forward a candidate for the castle, she does drop a word in Silverbridge mentioning that she supposes Ferdinand Lopez would probably be a safe bet. That's as far as she goes. And when her husband reprimands her on it, she immediately sends a letter to Lopez and says, I'm afraid I can't do anything for you. After having raised his hopes. Now that's going to become a major source of contention later on, because in these chapters we see that Ferdinand Lopez does take the bait. The idea of being in Parliament is irresistible to someone like him, even though he's told by Mr. Wharton, by Mr. Wharton's son, that as someone who's not quite an Englishman, he probably can't understand what it means. Ferdinand Lopez doesn't care about patriotism; he cares about his own aggrandizement. So he does go down to Silverbridge and run for the election, and it turns out he's being opposed by none other than Arthur Fletcher, the totally virtuous young man who was to be his wife's fiancé. Arthur Fletcher had been, since childhood, a friend of Emily Wharton, and it was just assumed on all parts in the family, that on both families, that they would marry. Ferdinand Lopez comes along and ruins that by taking her away, but it's just salt to the wound. Oh my God, what's happening? Am I being raptured? Oh no, I don't think there's any way around that. All right, well, yeah. I'm being raptured, BookTube. After watching all of these videos of mine, you could probably have seen it coming. At least I don't sparkle. There's a scene in Silverbridge between Wharton and between Arthur Fletcher and Ferdinand Lopez, and it's an ugly scene. And Ferdinand Lopez has gone into this whole thing and assumed £500 of expense, just assuming that Mr. Wharton would pay the bill. Doesn't have any money of his own. That's quickly obvious. It's also quickly obvious to poor Emily that her that her fiancé doesn't really have any money, that he hasn't really been truthful with her about his financial status, and that he expects to just simply milk money from Mr. Wharton, who is exceedingly rich, for the foreseeable future. And it's a heartbreaking portrait that Trollope gives us of the gradual stages by which Emily Wharton goes from being the happiest girl in the world because she's married the man she loves, to being disillusioned with him, to losing more and more faith in him, to finally being dragged down to his level. It's a very affecting portrait. I wonder what you're thinking, because I could see the possibility here that maybe some of you will think that Emily Wharton is as insufferable as some of the other Trollope heroines we've seen who just can't seem to do anything but be milquetoast. We've seen some very strong female characters from Trollope's pen, but I don't think Emily Wharton is one of those. Or maybe you sympathize with her. I certainly do. This reading, I am sympathizing with her more than ever. My first few readings of this book, I was thinking, oh, come on. You're a sheltered girl, yes, but even you must see what Ferdinand Lopez is like. Why would you be in love with this creature? Why would you be in love with someone who is so obviously mood-driven and so obviously greed-driven? Maybe she just finds Arthur Fletcher boring. Or maybe she has a rebellious streak of her own. One way or another, Ferdinand Lopez, the chapters that we're reading today are, in addition to being him gradually dragging Emily Wharton down to his level, they're also him gradually ingratiating himself to get more and more from Mr. Wharton. He goes to Mr. Wharton expecting, hoping, wheedling that £500 out of him for his election expenses, and gets it. He suggests at one point in these chapters that maybe he and Emily should give up their expensive house and go live with Mr. Wharton in his big house. And gets it. Mr. Wharton agrees immediately. All of these things make it look like Wharton is going to be something of a pushover, something that Ferdinand Lopez can take advantage of forever. And there's a point here, early on, I'm backtracking here, we'll go back to the beginning, where we see Ferdinand Lopez and Emily on their honeymoon. They go to Florence, and they look at all the pictures, and they look at all the statues, and there's a point here that I just wanted to mention, because the line always makes me laugh when I come across it. Because Ferdinand Lopez, the whole time they're in Florence, is thinking about money. We're told that he genuinely loves Emily Wharton. We're told that he genuinely does. But he's also constantly thinking about money, and he's assuming that her father is going to settle a fortune on her. And there's no mention of it. In the run-up to their marriage, there's no mention of it. At the point of their marriage, there's no mention of it. And when they go off on their honeymoon, there's no mention of it. There's no mention from Mr. Wharton of money. We're told in these chapters that Emily Wharton had the sort of vague idea that a vast sum of money would have been settled on her husband if her husband had been Arthur Fletcher. But instead, there's nothing at all. And when they're in Italy, Ferdinand Lopez is trying to enjoy himself. He's trying to put it off. But he eventually comes to the point where he suggests to Emily that maybe she should write to her father about money. Just wondering that the letter shouldn't come from him, it should come from her. And she eventually does, and that's the start of this whole gradual degradation. But before that, Trollope has a wonderful line. I chuckled when I read it, so I wanted to read it to you, where he says, "We have already seen that under the pressure of his thoughts, he did not break his first resolution within an hour or two of his marriage." This is Ferdinand Lopez, and the initial resolution being referred to here is that he's just going to enjoy himself for his honeymoon, that the money troubles can wait until later. And we're told that he did not break his first resolution within an hour or two of his marriage. But it is easy for a man to say that he will banish care so that he may enjoy to the full the delights of the moment. But this is the power which none but a savage possesses, or perhaps an Irishman. I don't know what kind of Irish people. Actually, I do know what kind of Irish people Trollope was dealing with, and I think he must have misread them, because I have never yet myself met an Irish person who was perfectly content with the moment. so I don't believe that Trollope did either. Oh, look at that! Don't you agree with me, BookTube? Oh, aren't I right about everything, BookTube? Oh, tell me, BookTube, who do you think is God's favorite booktuber? Ooh. So anyway. Now I'm sorry, I'm basically a child. Now that we're done, we've done these chapters. I have a million questions for you. Like, for instance, one thing I want to remember when we're doing this read along is that a lot of you probably aren't that familiar with the local politics of the 19th century England. How much of this seems strange to you? Not only the idea of pocket boroughs, but of how the whole thing is done. It's certainly very different from the American system, and maybe you went into that thinking that. Maybe you went into that kind of expecting that the American system would be more or less the reflection of how electoral politics happens in this book, and it doesn't at all happen that way. And also, tell me about all the rest of it. For instance, what about the epic battle of wills in these chapters? The epic battle of wills that we see here is between the Duke of Omnium and the Duchess of Omnium. The Duke of Omnium, of course, has the final say. He is the head of the household. He is the man. He is the title holder and all that. So he tells his wife, this has to stop. I don't want you interfering in the Silverbridge election. I don't want you carrying on hospitality at this enormous rate anymore. I want all of it to stop. And she is 100% convinced that he is wrong about all of it, and that she knows better. And they have some harsh words. They have some of the baldest segments that we have ever seen between these two characters. At one point, she actually tells him, well, it's in your nature to forbid me to do this, and it's in my nature to disobey. And I'm just sorry that you don't have a better wife. What an amazing thing for her to say to her husband. It wounds him. He's a very gentle, thin-skinned creature, as we've seen. And it wounds him deeply. She says, I'm sorry you don't have a better wife. The Duke of St. Bunge's wife, for instance, never talks to him about politics, never bothers him about anything. The only time she ever complains is about the direction of the east wind. Meaning, the implication being that the Duke of St. Bungay has a brainless nonentity as a wife, and that maybe the Duke of Omnium is secretly or not so secretly pining for having such a wife. But I'm sorry, you don't have one. And what about what happens with Emily Wharton? Was it breaking her heart while it was happening? That she's slowly but surely realizing the nature of the man she married? I just think I read things like this. I mean, we've done this point many times before. I read sections like this, done with such a masterful hand, and I am mystified that at the 50 years of Trollope readership, the common perception of Trollope for 50 years, about 50 years ago, that he is a secondary author to the major Victorian authors. I just don't see that, especially not in things like this. Just because it's enjoyable to read, I just don't see it. So tell me all about what you thought. Sorry this video went on so long, but, you know, I have a mandate from above. So I'm going to stop doing that for now. I'm going to stop doing that. I'll wrap this up for now. Tell me all that you thought, and we'll move on. Next Sunday, we'll do the next batch. It's very easy in this case to deal with the page divisions because these are all divided up for us already. This is divided up into 4 books, into 4 parts anyway. So we'll just do the next part for next Sunday. So I will see you then. Thank you, Book 2.